Good morning to some, good afternoon to others, and welcome to Absolute Justice, Kindness, and Kinship, a new approach to criminal justice reform. And thank you for choosing our session today. My name is Ibrahim Naim, and I will be the moderator of this session, which is being presented by the Alliance for Absolute Justice. I and my colleagues are humbled to have been selected to participate in this esteemed summit, and we are honored to present an Islamic viewpoint in this immensely important conversation on racial justice. The Alliance for Absolute Justice is a sister organization to the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, a missionary-based revival movement in Islam initiated in 1889 in India that was brought to the United States in 1920. We are currently celebrating our centennial anniversary. We have over 60 chapters across the United States and one here in Pittsburgh. Upon the arrival of the first Muslim missionary to the United States, Mufti Muhammad Sadiq, may Allah be pleased with him, his early experience with the American social order exposed the very divisive and oppressive issue of racial injustice and bigotry. The respected Mufti became deeply involved in addressing this issue, and through presenting the Islamic teaching and example of true brotherhood and absolute justice. At that time in US history, the great movement of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, founded by Marcus Garvey, was at its zenith. The respected Mufti became actively involved as a speaker at their conventions and meetings as his religious duty to support the advancement of justice and human dignity. It is with this spirit of social activism in pursuit of justice and human dignity that the Alliance for Absolute Justice was initiated last year. Our aim is to advocate for the eradication of injustice, which lies at the root of every social problem, and to collaborate with organizations already working in this area who share common values, vision, and objectives in order to establish absolute justice, kindness, and kinship. Now that you know a little bit about us, let's talk about today's program. We will begin with a short video trailer taken from a recent documentary produced by the Ahmadiyya Muslim community entitled The Golden Rule, after which we will hear an overview of the Islamic concept of absolute justice, kindness, and kinship from Imam Azhar Hanif, chairman of the Alliance for Absolute Justice and National Vice President of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Community, USA. Let's see the video.
No justice, no peace.
For God's sake, in order to remove this hatred within your own circles, please act with justice, act with equality, and respect the feelings of others so that the peace can be restored.
Please.
Hazur himself had seen the video, the pain in Hazur's voice and grief. He kept saying, "I can't breathe," and still the police didn't show any mercy.
True peace cannot be established until there is justice.
Both the fourth and fifth Khalifa have always been able to put their finger on the real issue which brings about racial tensions.
Black inequity in the Western Hemisphere is a 400-year problem. How are we going to fix it? By simply throwing up some signs and posting things on social media.
This divided nation, this racialized nation, is now being torn apart again.
I fear that there is going to be a big civil war.
What we're seeing now at night it's nothing short of a civil war.
Revive the religion.
Our Khalifa helps bring about order.
Until there's honesty and justice, no solution will ever prove beneficial.
A lot of the issues that the black community faces, I'm not facing it because I've attached myself to Caliphate and I've attached myself to the Nizam.
Let them hate you if they like. So, beloveds of America, you will become the Sayyids of America.
Every year they have the UK Jalsa, we send a delegation there. You can see how excited they all were. It's like kids in the candy shop.
Unless Asian, white, African American consider themselves equal to each other, we will not be truly fulfilling our pledge.
Absolutely, this is the only answer for my country and for the world. To treat your fellow humankinds as you would treat to yourself. This is called the Golden Rule.
the religion of Islam.
Respected Azhar Hanif Sahib.
Brother Ibrahim Naim and my fellow colleagues on this panel and this very important Racial Justice Summit, and all those who have taken some time out of their day to join us. I begin with the Islamic greeting of peace, which is also universal. Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. The beginning of that trailer, which we all just watched, encapsulates the concept of justice that has been echoing throughout the streets, the halls, in media, in every form, this past year in particular. And one cry, and we always hear, is this: no justice, no peace. It is this message of a link between the importance of justice and why this conference and every conference of its nature is so critical, because the conversation is long overdue on how do we achieve justice. I recall decades ago, when I left this country as a very young man, I was studying in a university, and I decided to travel the world and visit that place, which I call my spiritual center, in India and then in Pakistan. During the visit to Pakistan, in the company of hundreds of thousands of people, delegations from around the world, including one from the United States of America, in which I was part of. On the final day of that conference, the spiritual leader of our community, whose name was Mirza Tahir Ahmad, he stood up and delivered an address that changed my life forever. The words that he selected were so profound in its scope that I, as a student, suddenly changed the course of my life and decided from that point forward to dedicate myself to the principle and precepts he was articulating. I want to share just a very brief passage of the opening statement, and it's based on a verse of scripture found in the Holy Quran. That scripture is, "Verily God enjoins justice and the doing of good to others and giving like kindred." It's in chapter 16, verse number 91. He then went on to explain and said in this closing address, God does not command us to exercise justice alone, but also desires us to voluntarily add benevolence, and then to move forward to the third stage of human relationships, which is treating others like kin, like relatives. A spontaneous expression of love and care as experienced by a mother for her child. He then explains what he means by this highest level, this third degree of human relations, a degree greater than justice. He says, when a mother loves her child, she does so without any element of design and without any trace of pretense. It is but a natural flow which she does not generate, but one with which she is carried away. Spontaneity is always central to her expression of love for her dear ones. This illustrates fully the spirit of treating others like kin. So in this message, which I said was so profound and struck me to the core of my being, he mentions these three particular stages of just relations with others. The first stage is absolute justice, to treat others as one wants to be treated. The golden rule, which all faith and secular, moral, philosophical points of view talk about this golden rule. But then to go beyond that golden rule, which is critical for us as we're going to analyze today, how it relates to every aspect of our life in this particular forum criminal justice. The next level is so critical because this is where we're trying to push ourselves as an individual, as a society. He says, to learn the art of returning more than the other is due. So even if one mistreats you, you treat them well. Or as it said, don't let someone's enmity or hate cause you to be unjust and to reciprocate hate with hatred, but to always keep the sense of doing more, doing good for the other. That is the next level. And as you can see, even in the statements of many of our civil rights leaders, such as Martin Luther King, who talked about basic justice, that if we're always going to operate on the level of basic justice, and it's going to be an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, the world will be full of what? Blind and toothless people. Because at some point, you have to go beyond that strict measure of simple, basic justice. You do good to me, I do good back. You do evil to me, I can do that much in return. But this next level of goodness requires us to go higher. But then there's a highest level, and he talks about to treat others with such grace and overwhelming benevolence as one would treat one's close relatives. No feeling of pride finds any place in this relationship. Our benevolence is extended in such a manner that we consider it our duty, our obligation, and not a favor to others. There's no mother that cares for her child who's thinking that, oh, by doing this in the future, this child may become rich and take care of all my needs. Or I'm doing it so that this child can begin to praise me and to extol my goodness. It's a natural desire, and nothing of that nature comes into being. And this is the highest level that we're talking about. So in the end, he states in this powerful address, humanity is in dire need of the application of this universal principle. And that's what we want to talk about today. Our world, as we all have seen, particularly in this last year, are in dire need of this level of justice, kindness, and relationship based on kinship, that we become a human family and not just a society of citizens, not just a group of neighbors who love one another, not just a group of people on this earth who are sharing a common space and time, but understand the greater concept that we are part of this global family. And all of us are linked together and interconnected. And our relation with one another has to be on this higher plane if we're going to survive as a community, a global community, and every single one of us then can benefit. So here he says, all of its ills in the world which we are seeing in the world are responsible for polluting and contaminating human relationships are directly born of a lack of the application of justice. Mankind stands in need of justice so desperately that if we do not teach this to people in light of these principles, man will continue to suffer heavily at the hands of fellow man. Now here, in the end, I just want to reiterate, this was in 1982. And this wasn't in response to what we've seen recently in the streets of America, the brutal killings of individuals by police, the lack of justice across the board as a system which stagnates people of color in this nation. But if I go back 100 years ago, the history of our community, again, was mentioned in 1920. The year before our first missionary came to America, it was called the Red Summer in America. And that history then reminds us of the acts of injustice and brutality being perpetrated by the majority community, European Americans, against the minorities, in particular African Americans, who were being lynched that summer. It stated that over 80 people were lynched in 34 race riots throughout the country. This is the land in which our first missionary stepped foot and began to talk about this injustice. But I want to leave you with one last passage by the spiritual head of our community at that time, talking about this injustice, what we're seeing repeated over and over again, and we'll keep seeing repeated in these cycles of history repeating itself unless we all focus on how to establish justice, absolute justice, kindness in our relation, and this sense of being a kin, a family, and loving each other like a mother. No mother would have done to George Floyd what that officer did. In fact, George Floyd was calling out to his mother. No officer who had this kind of love in his heart could have done what this man did. No one could have done to Breonna Taylor what that person did, or Eric Gardner, or any of the people we think about now talking about criminal justice. A mother could not have done that to her child. So what we're saying is if we have the spirit of mother in us, and this consciousness that we are part of this human family and we are acting toward each member in the family like a mother toward a child, the injustice would cease to a major degree, and no law, no commission, no effort would need to be made after that if that spirit, that understanding, that consciousness of the human being begins to reign. So he said, and I can close with this, in America, such atrocities are committed on racial grounds that leave one astonished. Again, this is 1919, 100 years ago. This is a country which claims to be the torchbearer of justice and equity. Recently, a 19-year-old man of Black race named Lloyd Clay, who was accused of a crime, although later proven innocent, was in custody in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Some of you may know this case of Lloyd Clay and during that year of the Red Summer. He says members of the general public broke into the jail cell, and a crowd of 1,500 people gathered to punish him severely. He was stripped naked, hanged on a tree, with some suggesting to kill him, while others said no, he should die a slow, torturous death. They threw kerosene oil on his body and lit a bonfire, and then all men and women enjoyed as he screamed, yelled, and cried for help for an hour and a half. We think about George Floyd, 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Imagine 100 years ago what was happening in the streets of America. Imagine the lack of humanity and compassion and kindness and even justice. A crowd of 1,500 men, women, children standing and watching this scene, and what it meant about us as a people in our nation, and where we were and where we need to be. He ends by saying, his dead body was removed, and the pieces of the burnt rope that he was tied with were kept as souvenirs. And the tree he was hanged to was declared a sacred monument. He then asked this question and poses that President Wilson declared once in a statement, how could America promote democracy while it is demeaning it by proving it cannot protect the most vulnerable in its own shores? These are words today we're going to not just talk about, think about, but try to see the ways we can become those citizens now, that nation now, and look at particularly the criminal justice system and bring about that change in our own selves, in our system, that prevent these atrocities from happening in the streets of America, in the jails of America, in the criminal justice system of America. And may God help us to do so. Thank you for the time, and I turn back to our moderator, Ibrahim Naeem.
Thank you, Imam, for that elucidating overview and explanation. Before we begin the next segment of our session, I want to inform our attendees that there will be a question and answer segment at the conclusion of the following 4 presentations. As your questions arise during the presentations, please write them down or put them in the chat. Be sure to note who the question is addressed to. In the question and answer, raise your hand to be unmuted so you can ask your questions. Now it is my privilege to introduce Abdul Latif Balanta, Esquire, civil rights legal advisor, author, speaker, consultant, who's joining us from Baltimore, Maryland, and who will speak on the need for bail reforms.
Peace be with you, everyone. Thank you for having me. For the last 30 years, I've been a licensed attorney, and I've been fortunate enough to see the criminal justice system from the inside as well as the outside, not actively practicing now criminal law. When people refer to the need for criminal justice reform, most often they're thinking about the police brutality, which is quite often prior to arrest, or they may be thinking about the prison industrial complex, which houses criminals at a larger extent in the United States more than any place in the world. And from those two ends, there's actually a need for reform all throughout the process. So what I'm going to do today is just to deal with one sliver of where there's a need for criminal justice reform, and that is prior to trial. I've chosen this area because it is one of the dynamic areas where there is actually experimentations going on right now as we speak in the United States. As you know, every state allows its own criminal system when adjudicating the criminal laws. With regard to the federal laws, they're all the same throughout all 50 states. And I'm referring mostly to the state laws in this presentation. But there's a very little variance between the pretrial process at the state level, as well as that of the, as distinct from that of the federal level. The next slide, please. The first slide. Now this picture shows the entire process prior to arrest to the determination of what the bail is going to be, whether a person actually makes bail or not en route to trial. The United States, as you know, has 2.3 million people who are incarcerated, more than any other nation in the world. And of those people who are incarcerated, about 746,000 of them are in the jail system. As you probably know, the jail system is where people are housed who have not yet been convicted, or they may be in the jails serving out a short-term sentence. Most of what happens in terms of the long-term sentences happens at the prison system. But what's most interesting about those 746,000 that are in the jail system, you need to bear in mind that these are people, 74% of them, which is 631,000, these are people who have not yet been tried in most instances. That is, they've not yet been even charged in some instances, but once they're charged, they still have that presumption of innocence. And that's the most important thing that we have to bear in mind. Because if our system is to treat them according to its theory, then the people should be treated with the same presumptions and the benefits and the burdens of proof. All of those need to be on the prover, which is the state. I must also say that our system, the American criminal justice system, in theory, has built in it those necessary checks and balances to administer justice more so than any other system in the world. But it is only in theory that we're able to, that we see that it is administered, because in many instances, those prejudices, those preconceived notions, those biases that the system allows to creep into it, both in the selection of the jury as well as in the determination of bail, as we'll see. Those things are part of the things that's baked into the system. What I'm going to point out to today is some of the reforms that are occurring and are proposed in many states. And these reforms take a real practical kind of approach. The idea is that human nature is going to be what it is. But if you want to treat an individual with the respect that he deserves and to live up to the tenets of the system, which says that he's still innocent, then these are some of the reforms that should be considered. First on the chart, you see after the before arrest. Now, at the arrested stage, one of the reforms that is proposed and is happening in some select states, particularly in New York, is that rather than even charging and booking this individual, one of the reforms is that those low-level offenses could be just submitted to a citation. That is, an individual doesn't have to become embroiled in the criminal justice system. Rather, the justice requires or would dictate that a ticket for that breach of the peace or that violation of the law is probably most in order. Thus, in that case, the individual would pay a fine or submit in some other kind of way to the system, but he need not be embroiled in and have this criminal record, which could haunt him for the rest of his life. So that is one of the first reforms. That is, you just issue a citation for some of these low-level things, low-level offenses. After an individual is charged, he is arrested, then he is charged and booked. This is the part where, from that point forward, he has a contact with the criminal justice system that could haunt him for the rest of his life, even though he is not yet convicted. At this phase, one of the reforms that could take place and is taking place in a few select places is that rather than subject him to a bond, now, as you understand, the bond system is almost like an insurance policy, and bail bondsman is an industry in the United States where the bail bondsmen make money. The more people that are charged, then the more the bail bondsman has customers. This industrialization of the criminal justice system is another thing that is very unique to the American system. We've made a business just about out of everything, and someone is profiting every time someone is arrested. And I can't hammer enough that these are innocent people, according to our system, that are having to now pay bond to just have their innocence determined by the state. So one of the things that is proposed here is that rather than have that bond kind of a system, that more people should be allowed, just on the basis of their ties to the community, just on the basis of their work relationship, just on the basis of their family ties, they need to be able to sign on their own reconnaissance, saying that, you know me, community, this is where I'm from, and I will come to court. And that is the whole purpose of the bail system, to ensure that the individual is going to come to court. Now, in the top portion of this diagram, this chart uses 100 people with regard to a bail example. Just to choose a right round number. And at the top, it says that 4 of those people are being denied bail at the pretrial level. When we talk about justice reform, our best arguments are not arguing in 4 of that 4% of the people. These 4% of the people who are charged with crimes are facing such crimes as are criminal, where they pose a threat to the society or to the victim, and it may be in the best interest of justice and to preserve the peace of the community and society that those 4% are not allowed to have bail. So our arguments, we're not going to be arguing for that 4% when we're talking about bail reform. But it is these other 2 categories where we're actually proposing and seeing that there is a need for other criminal justice reform. Down at the bottom, if you look there at the very bottom, you see that there are about 24 people that are released on non-financial grounds. Now, this is where those people are allowed to go into some kind of a program. They've been allowed to do community service, or they've been allowed to sign on their own reconnaissance because of the nature of the crime. Again, those 24% is more like what we would like to see in terms of the inquiry into their fitness for bail. These 2 other categories below them is the ones that when we're really directing our attention to when we say that there's a need for bail reform. Because just below the bottom one, there are a group of individuals, about 38%, who are able to pay their bail money. So at that point, the R that we refer to there is just a more equitable, more fair determination of what the bail should be. And those individuals are released, 38%, as you see at the end there, are released, and they're released because they posted some bail. In most instances, it's about 10% of what the actual charge is. And the bail bondsman, of course, as you know, he posts a policy, an insurance policy, for that that security, and he actually makes that money. He actually makes that percentage and is able to keep that portion, even if the individual comes to trial and reports and goes back and forth just like he's supposed to until the matter is over. So again, those 38% of the people, we do believe that there needs to be more consideration in terms of community ties, work history, and other contacts with the criminal justice system in terms of reforming there. It is this middle category, those individuals who can't afford bail, that we're really addressing our attention to. And that is about 34% out of every 100. You would be surprised that for $200 in terms of the cash bail that someone would have to put up, many people are sitting languishing in prison because they can't afford that $200. And what we're proposing is that we take many or any of the other off-ramps before we get to this point. And those individuals sometimes sit languishing in the jail system, sometimes for months, even years before their case comes up for trial. This is the essence of the nature of the reform that we speak about when we talk about criminal justice reform. And then finally, with regard to those who are able to post bail, even those individuals in most states still have to pay the cost for their probation prior to the trial. And if they are unable to pay those costs, those court costs, then they can be reincarcerated just for failure to pay those kinds of costs. This is the nature, this is the essence of what we argue about when we talk about bail reform as a component of needing criminal justice reform. And there are thousands of individuals who are languishing in prison for just a few $100s because they are living in poverty. And that's not what our country is about. And that's not the theory of the criminal justice system that we all recognize as being more advanced and more superior in theory than any other system in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Attorney Balanta. And you have brought a good insight into an area that is a dire need in terms of bail reform. People are often imprisoned for poverty. So next we'll have, I'd like to welcome Attorney Saif Rahman. He's a criminal defense attorney and a former public defender. He's been working in the court systems of LA for the last 15 years and has much experience in the same situation of what he calls the criminal punishment system. So welcome, Attorney Rahman. We'll look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Peace and blessings to all of you. As you've heard, I titled my brief talk, The Criminal Punishment System. And the reason I've done this is because over the last 40 years, and personally the last 16 years that I've been involved with it, that's essentially what it's evolved into. As you heard from my colleague just before me, Balanta, so the criminal justice system that we have on paper is unbelievable. It's amazing in this country. We have rights against unreasonable search and seizure, rights against cruel and unusual punishment, many things that would make you think our system is perfect. But unfortunately, as we all know, as why we're having this conference, is that we have lots of flaws in our system. The biggest flaw that we have, or the flaws that we have that are exacerbated, are by the people that implement them. And that's the problem. Just like with any system, it can be great on paper, it has to be implemented by people. The people I'm really focusing on in the courtroom are not just the judges and the defense attorneys and probation officers and so on, it's the prosecutors. The prosecutors are the people who have the most power in a courtroom. They are the ones that are set to file charges, and they are the only ones that can dismiss charges. So this golden rule that we speak about, they are the ones for our system to work right that need to act with benevolence, with kindness to be able to achieve justice. And I have many friends and colleagues that are prosecutors, and I'll ask them, why did you become a prosecutor? Many times they will say, well, I want to put criminals behind bars. However, though, the American Bar Association itself, in its criminal justice standards for prosecutors, says that the primary duty of the prosecutor is to seek justice, not to merely convict. It further states that they should exercise discretion to not pursue criminal charges in appropriate circumstances. And unfortunately, this really isn't the case. If we can go to the next slide, please. Historically, we have had, and not just in this country, but historically throughout the world, in every culture, the reasons for punishment have been a mix of what we call deterrence, incapacitation, rehabilitation, and retribution. And as you'll see on the next slide, please, each of these can have its own use, but when they're used together in a mix is when they're most effective. None of them being used by themselves can ever be effective. And we take these into account. For example, if we have a substance abuse case and we're looking at rehabilitation, or if we have a first-time offender, and so on. So unfortunately, the courts and the prosecution have been focused on incarcerating people for long and extraordinary sentences, mainly through the use of sentence enhancements. Sentence enhancements are charged and alleged by prosecutors, and in most cases, in almost all the cases, even judges don't have the ability to strike these enhancements. And these are enhancements that can add on 10, 15, 20 years, merely for just a possession of a weapon that was not even used at the time of a commission of a crime, potentially just the weapon being in the car at the time that a crime might have been committed. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll see that police are arresting and prosecutors are locking up African Americans at an alarming rate. We know in this country it's 5 to 1 compared to whites. And what we're seeing is because they are given such high sentences, we'll see that African Americans are a much higher percentage in custody at all levels, from juveniles all the way up to over 65 years old. And this is what's really making this problem a systemic problem that we have. And one of the things that we've seen as incarceration period grows longer, the deterrent aspect goes away. Human beings are adaptive animals. And go to the next slide. I can just tell you that as a juvenile public defender, I would be in court many times. A client would come in and he had been in custody for the first time ever, and he was scared and crying, sniveling, wanting to get out. However, he might have had a 30-day offer or a 60-day offer. So when I would see him again in a couple of weeks to go over the case, it was a different person. He had adapted to his surroundings, to that juvenile hall. He was walking around strutting and happy to sign for that 30 and 60 days. So that deterrent effect is really gone. And all that means what we're doing is we are punishing and being punitive just for that sake. And it's resulted in a major negative effect on African American youth. It's created this revolving cycle. As we see, almost half of the youth that are arrested or that are incarcerated today in this country are African Americans, yet they only make up 16% of the nation's youth. So, but just as with adults, but even worse for the youth, they're feeling this effect. You'll see from the next slide, African Americans and other minorities are less likely to be offered rehabilitation and treatment programs or diversion programs when arrested. What that means essentially is they are given probation, they are given parole, they are given forms of sentencing, which is essentially going to send them right back into prisons. And you'll see with the lowest level offenses, African Americans are given are violated on probation and parole at almost double the rate than all other youth, resulting in them being back into the prison system. There's also long-term effects that you'll see in the next slide. The long-term effects of incarcerating somebody are not just that incarceration time. If you give somebody 20 years of prison, he's lost that 20 years. Not only has he lost that 20 years, whatever time he has when he gets out, he's lost as well, because it is very difficult with a lack of vocational skills, with a lack of whatever degree, with prison priors to get jobs, as we know. And it's really exacerbated in the Black community. You can see that for, as they call it, the the effects of incarceration on African Americans, the prison penalty is almost double, or more than double, I'm sorry, what it is for white men that are incarcerated. So trying to find jobs becomes extremely difficult. And so this effect then also curtails down to their children, children who are raised without having both mother and father there, have negative effects as well, and are more likely to get involved in these systems as well. So on the next slide, just in conclusion, with regards to reforming the criminal justice system, and I'm focusing more so on prosecutors than the police and anybody else, because they have the power. These are people who are educated, have gone to law school, who have the ability to look at the police reports, look at what's happening, and decide and charge based off what would be fair, what would be just, and what would be beneficial to help society as a whole, to help make an individual a productive member of society. Unfortunately, though, this golden rule that we talk about is not being implemented, is not being thought of by the prosecutors, who really are the key to, once a false arrest or anything like that is made, to be able to fix that. And as I mentioned from that first slide, justice, absolute justice, is not what is what's called for in our penal code for prosecutors. So the current cycle of incarcerating young African Americans for these long unreasonable times can only really be changed if the people that are implementing these things change, and if they adopt this attitude of showing benevolence and kindred for others. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Attorney Rahman, for your enlightening presentation. I'm very pleased to introduce now Dr. Rashida Ahmed, who is Assistant Professor of Education at Cabrini University. She's an author and speaker whose academic interests focus on oppressive barriers to academic achievement. With more than 20 years in the social justice arena, she joins us from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Welcome, Dr. Ahmed.
Thank you very much. In the name of God, the gracious, the merciful, Assalamu alaikum, shalom, peace and blessings to everyone. I would like to thank the organizers, excuse me, of the Pittsburgh Racial Justice Summit for inviting AAJ, the Alliance for Absolute Justice, who are members of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. I'm the executive director of the Women's Division, and so I'm very honored to have a seat at this table, to participate, to have conversations, and hopefully, God willing, inshallah, form alliances with those committed individuals and organizations engaged in this important work of racial justice and criminal justice reform. I find this to be, even though we're online, to be an uplifting, inclusive space for thinking about, reflecting, and challenging ourselves to recognize the need for continued action, to be immersed in the deep soul work of truly coming together as community for the cause of social justice. Black and brown folk have spiritual traditions that have supported us and enabled us to be resilient when facing oppression. So this theme, rise, revolt, repeat, building sustained movements for justice, is a clarion call that this work is ongoing. The pandemic and the persistent killings of Black men, even after George Floyd's death, have laid bare this deeply seated injustice that this reckoning has occurred. And our society can no longer be lulled into this false sense that we've achieved a post-racial just society. So the work must continue. So when I listened to the opening libation by Malcolm Thomas yesterday evening, it was important themes that resonated and aligned with the Islamic principles of absolute justice, kindness, and kinship. He spoke of the principle of love as a substance beyond a feeling, but a principle of justice. And he also talked about the oneness of people, the voice of the divine guiding our choices. So my brief contribution to our conversation today will be that the rationale or reason for centering absolute justice, kindness, and kinship in criminal justice reform is because it provides a universal transformative vision of human relations needed to dismantle these oppressive structures that are deeply entrenched in our society. So if we move on to the next slide, the theme here is I just want to touch lightly on is that this idea that we've always been working together. Right from the very beginning, European Americans have worked side by side or aligned themselves with Black and Brown people to work towards justice. And so my reflection question for you, has change resulted in the transformation of societal racial structures? If you think that has happened, why or why not, particularly when we think about the protests. So I wanted to just call your attention to the Quakers, the first who really organized the first protests as whites against slavery in the Americas in 1688, which was based on this golden rule. The Quakers argued against inhumane treatment of their fellow man, regardless of the color of their skin. And so the document states, "We shall do to all men like as we will be done to ourselves, making no difference of what generation, descent, or color they are." If you think about the Underground Railroad, those secret network of houses and hideaways, and those were used by fleeing Africans to reach freedom in Canada. And so whites and Blacks sheltered these courageous individuals who sought to escape slavery. If you also think of the 1960s civil rights movement, ironically, we see the signs, "Stop Police Brutality." And here we are 60 years later, still protesting about the same thing. And then if you look at the Black BLM protests over the summer, they were a multi-ethnic group of people all over the world protesting police brutality. So let's move on to the next slide. I'm just really wanting us to think that this is why we need to center absolute justice, kindness, and kinship, because the over-policing and dehumanization of Black bodies is really this legacy of white supremacy that we've carried, and it persists. And it goes back as early as the colonial period. But before I look at that, just mention that historical evolution, we do have those two high-profile cases of women who were unfortunately murdered by police. And these women, Breonna Taylor and Tatiana Jefferson, they're high-profile cases. But we know from Michelle S. Jacobs' paper, The Violent State, Black Women's Invisible Struggle Against Police Violence, that in 2017, over a three-year period, there were 70 cases of Black women who had been killed at the hands of police. From 2013 to 2020, there's no accountability. 98.3% of killings by police have not resulted in officers being charged with a crime. So there's this need to just really dismantle this whole system that dehumanizes humans, dehumanizes Black bodies, and categorizes all of us into these different races, which supports this idea of implicit and explicit dehumanization of the descendants of African slaves. So if we look at the historical evolution of violence, we see that it started around the 1500s to the 1600s, where you see this European colonial expansion. It's solely for the purpose of economic greed. And so you see them instituting just horrific types of genocide and violence against Black and brown bodies. And often written out of history is really a Hitler or a hidden Holocaust that happened in the Congo. King Leopold II actually killed 15 million Africans in the Congo. So genocide took place during this European expansion. And so moving on, you have the slave codes and patrols and Jim Crow and the lynching and the mob violence. And all of this really supports this idea that the Black man's body, the Black and brown body, is not a human body. It's not a body that should be valued. And so even during the slave patrols, white men could enforce these rules. They could enter any home at any time looking for runaways. By the early 19th century, you have the centralized police departments, and their job, these white males, their job was to control the underclass. And who would be the underclass? African Americans, immigrants, and poor people. And so you fast forward today, we have what Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow, where mass incarceration of Black men is occurring. And so she stresses the importance of really dismantling the entire system. And so if we move on to the next slide, where I just want to just revisit centering absolute justice and kindness. I wanted us to think about this universal transformative vision of human relationships. And Dr. Martin Luther King said in this quote, "We may have all come on different ships, but we're in the same boat now." And I also wanted to include the parable from the Holy Prophet of Islam. And he talks about, he gives this parable of society where he says, people who board a ship after casting lots, some of them residing in its upper deck and others in its lower deck. When those in the lower deck want water, they pass by the upper deck and say, if we tear a hole in the bottom of the ship, we will not harm those above us. If those in the upper deck let them do what they want, then they will all be destroyed together. So if they restrain them, they will all be saved together. So it's important for us to really think about how can we as humans really transform how we engage with each other. So I'm looking for comments and pose questions to us as well. And we want to always think about this idea that racial categorization is really socially constructed. There's no scientific basis for it. And part of centering absolute justice, kindness, and kinship is really to do away with these racial categories. And then I'm not talking about ancestry and ethnicity and culture, but this idea that we are separate people. We belong to one human race. And so if we look back at those principles, justice alone is not desirable. We have to add the benevolence. We also want to move on to another stage, the third stage of human relationships, where there's this spontaneous expression of love and care, just as if a mother would express that love for a child. A mother would do almost anything to help her child, to sacrifice for her child, to look after her child. And this is the kind of relationships that we need to strive towards. So if I move on to our very last slide, I just wanted to contrast the differences between where we're at now in society and how centering absolute justice, kindness, and kinship and criminal justice reform, how they might look different or how they look different. So if we're looking at the principles of absolute justice, kindness, and kinship, it's based on free will. You're dismantling this racial caste system that this burden that we've been carrying for centuries. And so there's humanity and dignity for all. And the standards of justice do not change based on personal interests, regarding someone's race, or class, or wealth. And so society members continue to rise in their achievements intellectually and morally. And there's this feeling of social progress, that the communities are stronger. But if we look at on the other side of it, and some would say this is where we're at now, when we continue with these dehumanization policies and this over policing of Black bodies, Black and brown bodies, we continue to deal with this inherited malignant feature of American life that reproduces each generation. And then application of justice differs based on racial privilege. And then there's this social unrest and this idea that racism is permanent. And so we're indifferent to the suffering of others. We even blame the victims. And then we see that there are many systems that sort of feed into mass incarceration, the school to prison pipeline. There's this call for violence. And so you find society really sort of descending into this sort of lowest moral states with violence and unjust police shootings. So I would ask today that let's try to have this conversation about how we can center absolute justice, kindness, and kinship in criminal justice reform. Thank you for taking the time to listen.
And thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed, for your engaging presentation. Our final presenter is Dr. Basir Rodney, who is Professor of Education at Webster University. He's also president of the Pan-African Ahmadiyya Muslim Association and also a veteran of the Ferguson protests. He will present on violence as a public health concern. He joins us from St. Louis, Missouri. Welcome, Dr. Rodney.
Thank you, Ibrahim Sahib. It's interesting that I never kind of thought of myself as being that directly connected to the Ferguson protests, but I appreciate the kudos. First, let me thank the audience for being here. I appreciate you taking the time on a Saturday afternoon to come out. While I kind of get one or two slides situated for you, I'm going to post a question in the chat because I kind of like the conversations back and forth. And it's not to put anybody on the spot, but I have a curiosity question as to how we all come at this work. And I know I won't be able to read everyone's, but I kind of want to get a sense of where everybody out there, the 80 something people out there, your backgrounds kind of move. So I'm going to post a question in the chat for you. And the question is kind of loaded, right? It's asking you in this state and this time where you find yourself, what aspect of injustice are you kind of working to dismantle, right? And I know there are many aspects right now. We're talking about critical justice and reform, but I kind of want to get a sense of where you find yourself and how you come to this work. So if you're able, go ahead and type away, even as I kind of center some of this conversation. Continuing that, I really appreciate the organizers of the Pittsburgh Racial Justice Summit. As the Alliance was kind of coming together, we're looking for spaces to kind of push into and engage. We were pleased to find this summit to be able to kind of spend time and talk about what we are struggling to do ourselves, and then to have a group of people that we can learn from and learn with. And from yesterday, I've kind of been popping in and out of the different sessions and really learning about some of the conversations around designing new systems, new approaches, newer ways of thinking about this work that is social justice in our country and in the world. And just this morning, you know, I spent some time with the Enough is Enough documentary, looking at the life of Johnny Gamage, around which, you know, Pittsburgh's moment, if you will, to kind of build out this conference and these experiences and the allyship and solidarity that came out of that. And I'm struck that, you know, it's almost 30 years, an entire generation between the killing of Gamage and also now the killing of George Floyd. And I know that's a small period of time, you know, as Arnif took us back to nearly 100 years. And so we are still very deeply embedded in this work, in this struggle, if you will. So I kind of come at this right now in this moment. I'm working on with a number of different groups here in St. Louis, and I'm really just highlighting their work, right? This is me kind of plugging into different boxes and representing, if you will, that struggle for absolute justice myself, right? Where we think about how we support each other and our fellow brothers and sisters in faith and in life, in humanity, as we collectively struggle to try to change the system that we find ourselves in. And thank you for posting. I see some of our allies here talking about their work around environment and their work around transportation and hiring policies, and really, really powerful types of engagement. And one of the things I wanted to kind of highlight with that chat panel going up is the fact that the work we're doing is obviously valuable, but it is also expansive. For the world in which we live and in the country in which we live to come to the kind of vision. One of the examples from a session I was in this morning was, think about where we would be 100 years from now in the case of a project, in this case, the Alliance for Absolute Justice. So if we got to the place where we had the most just society that we could construct, what would it look like? What would it be like? What would it feel like? And then we kind of track back from there. And so as I see your voice is kind of coming up in that chat, I see you struggling I see you demonstrating this kind of expansiveness. So violence as a public health concern, I think this is a new space that we have to push into, and we're learning to do that because, as Dr. Rashida laid out really well, violence has been the pathology of the rise of the social, political, and economic systems that now define us, right? I know there are those of us who are enjoying all of the goodness of these systems, right? Zoom allows us to have our conversations, and we can go to the bank and swipe our ATM cards, and all kinds of new systems in place for us to live what is a meaningful life in a country like ours. But at the end of the day, the origin story of our system is violence, massive human violence of one people against many other peoples. And so with that kind of violence embedded in the system, we have to deal with the pathology of violence. And we're only now just learning that. So one of the projects that we're working through here in St. Louis, we're just rolling this out, is a project called Cure Violence. And I want to talk a little bit about Cure Violence. Again, not as a representative of Cure Violence, it's an international movement, just how we're kind of working to bring it to St. Louis and how we have been learning as a community to deal with and treat violence as a pathology based on the model that Cure Violence is presenting. So on the one hand, we're approaching a place where we're recognizing that violent action usually has an origin, obviously, and then it has a series of repercussions, right? So whether that is in violence has its roots in poverty, has its roots in injustice, has its roots in challenges in the family, it begins somewhere and then it spills out typically into the society, right? And so a part of what the Cure Violence model is trying to get us to think about is, well, what if we stop treating violence as a thing that we can mass incarcerate, right? Going back to what Abdul Latif Balanta was saying earlier, we rather than think about more creative ways to lock up more people and then criminalize and demonize more people, can we think of this as a pathology in our society that we can then mitigate through different kinds of strategies that are more ameliorating? So if violence, for example, right now we're in the middle of a pandemic, so we understand what it means to find a targeted area where you see the flare up, bring a series of resources around that targeted area, and then using strategies to help to mitigate violence in that area. And on this slide, you see a map of Cure Violence effort across the United States right now, places where they're working and finding success, right? And like I said, we're new to St. Louis. So the parts of it that's really important to us in St. Louis and any community that's rolling it in is, number one, it's built on community involvement. The Cure Violence team kind of comes to a community. So if you look at this map, you see these localized areas. They come to a local community, they look at a neighborhood, they look at the statistics, then they try to identify people in the community that can interrupt violence. And that's what we call them, they're called interrupters. Individuals that are trained to be able to see situations before they escalate and then de-escalate those situations, right? And there's a training system that goes for each of the interrupters that allows them to be able to go into situations that see something that might be going out of hand and then try to mitigate that situation to alleviate violence flaring up. The other side of that, there's a steering committee that's built at the, again, cross-community level. So people who might not necessarily be in the day-to-day task of navigating or interrupting, but people who are involved in looking at the overall picture of a city or a town or the locality, and then form a kind of steering committee. And we identify people that Cure Violence can connect with. So it's a very community-driven model, a very participatory model. And I want to say too that whatever work we're engaged in, we have to think about ways in which each of us can engage with others. So if I had time, I'm about to give back time, but the last question I'd leave with you is who are you allied with in this work, right? Because it is a work of community, right? The idea of the golden rule is to do unto others and not to just be in isolation. So this is one model that we think we're hopeful for, we're hopeful about. You see some of the statistics here on the screen, and then we've connected with and are trying to work through in places like St. Louis and Chicago and other places. Naeem Saib?
Thank you so much, Dr. Rodney. And now that's a very interesting presentation. And I didn't mean to misrepresent you as being out there protesting in Ferguson. simply that, you know, these things find their way. You are involved in the community and they find their way to your doorstep.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there are a couple of questions. Marilyn, I just saw your question. Who are the interrupters? So based on how the model works, they're selected from the communities where violence typically is occurring. So they're drawn from community members, and they're regular folks. They might have had their own run-in with violence at different points in time. They might have been, you know, for a better phrase, reformed gang members, or people who might have themselves been incarcerated and come out of incarceration and are turning their lives around and are now taking this opportunity to be a part of the change. And just so you also know, in the case of most of our cities that are implementing this model, interrupters are like paid positions as well, right? Because a part of what we're trying to do is to not just make it a situation where people are always kind of just volunteering, right? When we think about COVID right now, we're fighting COVID with people with skills, with training, and that can really impact the problem. And so a professional ethic needs to be applied to that as well.
We are opening up now for our question and answer session. So anyone with a question or comment can raise your hand and be recognized.
If I might, I did see one question in the chat that seemed to be directed to me. It asked, what are the first steps toward achieving those type of bail reforms? And I would suggest that because the district attorneys and the mayors are elected officials, then one of the first steps always goes back to voting. You need to express your opinion to those elected officials in terms of the kind of kinder, gentler justice system that you want, because they do have the power to implement it. I would also point out that many of the reforms that we saw here, that I pointed out, that the example that I cited were from New York, and it was single-handedly with the support of his city council that Mayor de Blasio took the initiative to actually institutionalize many of these kinds of reforms. One of the beauties of bail reform is that you don't need to pass a law to make the system much more accountable or gentle in terms of how it deals with the people. And this is what we see in many cities. So it's really having contact with those chief executive officers, the mayors, as well as the city councils and the district attorneys, letting them know your opinion. There's not many people advocating, however, for the criminals. And but we should recognize that when we're speaking about justice, we're talking about an issue that affects everybody, not just on behalf of alleged or accused criminals.
Thank you, Attorney Balanta. When you mentioned the fact that some of these things are really at our fingertips to change, let me just point out that I live in Los Angeles County, and we just had an election. Our previous district attorney, Jackie Lacey, was defeated, and George Gascon replaced her. And that was primarily because the people felt that she was too much aligned with the police and not as much aligned with the reforms that the community is looking to see implemented. So these things can happen. Your vote is powerful. Just organize and exercise your right.
Absolutely.
I'm looking for hands, but we'll keep trolling the chat too to see if anybody has any further questions.
I did see a second question in the chat that may be directed to me. It asked me if I was aware of a movement to try to elect more reform-minded district attorneys, and it asked about my experience in Philadelphia. It was 20-something, almost 30 years ago that I was dealing with the district attorney in Philadelphia. So I don't have any immediate experiences to share. But I would point out again that that district attorneys have the type of authority to say that because of their workload, because of the prison population, that they're going to create or direct their assistant district attorneys to push or to see if more people qualify for those existing kind of diversionary kind of programs. So there's a way to administer justice in a much more gentler form, and the district attorneys do have that power.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that emerges when we talk about criminal justice reform, one of the first things I kind of started to get involved in, which I think most people can begin to learn to get involved in, is police oversight or police engagement. In most municipalities and localities, the police department should have some kind of oversight or engagement board, and it's typically publicly elected. And I remember being involved in a local struggle here to create such an entity. And it was challenging, but we all understand that it needed to be done, and we worked hard on it. And I would say that if you're on this call, or if you know other people and they're looking for ways to just get involved, a part of what you want to do is get involved in the boards and the assemblies that are responsible for these kinds of changes in the system that Valanta so eloquently talked about in terms of its capacity and its ability. This election cycle really taught all of us the value of every voice at the ballot. And so I think that every voice at the ballot culture should drive what we all try to do. Each of us must be involved in some way.
Thank you. Actually, your just comments just now, Dr. Rodney Saab, made me think about the inauguration speech of President Biden. And he used the term "enough of us." And that term also reflects back also to Dr. Rashida Ahmed's comments about our involvement as a community. So when there is enough of us standing for justice, then we will see change happen. And we need to be constant in building our allies and furthering our commitments. And so that's why we are so thrilled to be able to participate today, because our name is Alliance for Absolute Justice, and we are seeking allies. We want to work with others who are working in this space. So you'll have a contact slide at the end of our presentation. Feel free to be in touch with us. I'm looking for some other questions.
There's one. What's the best way to carry this conversation to the colleges, example, law schools? And there are a couple of lawyers here, so they can talk about that. So criminal system leaders of the future are aware of this kind of systemic racism.
I would love to have had the book upon which our conversation is based. It's called Absolute Justice, Kindness, and Kinship. You can't see it with this virtual thing. Sorry about this, but it is the address that that Azhar Hanif spoke about that was so impactful on his life. The book was written by Mizar Tahir Ahmed, who was our fourth leader, Khalifa, and this kind of book would be wonderful to supplement the kind of case law, theoretical kind of instruction that we get in law school. And I would even go, I haven't gotten the permission to do this, but I am the outreach secretary here in Baltimore. And if someone would like this book, you can either email me for a digital copy, or you can send me your physical address, and I'll be happy to mail you a copy of this book. The more people who know about these, it's called the 3 Creative Principles: Absolute Justice, Kindness, and Kinship, the 3 Creative Principles, then the more that this message can be disseminated, and we can find a way to insert justice in every aspect of our lives. I'll put my email address in the chat, okay?
And let me remind people that you can simply unmute yourself and ask a question. So we want to make this simple for you.
Abdul-Latif, there's another question for you. A question for me was, what power does the engagement board have? So in our case, and again, if you know our context in the world of St. Louis, we have 90 municipalities in what is the St. Louis region. So we have complained about that it's too many. And the report that came out after the Ferguson unrest, called Forward Through Ferguson, advocated very strongly for consolidation of policing. We are still going through that struggle right now. But to your question, I think the first phase was simply to, number one, be able to look at statistics. So we were able to get statistics from the police about, you know, their stop data. Much of that is public anyways. And then we can have these conversations with the police about why is it that in a small municipality that has 90% or 80% white people, you know, 80 to 90% of your stops are Black people who mostly don't even live here, right? So I think at the first level, we're right now, we just have the ability to put pressure on the police using the tools we have, and at least we have a continuous listening ear. We don't yet have the kinds of power that I think we should evolve out of this kind of oversight, right? But I think all of us in the country are going through new approaches to policing as well that empower citizens more in contexts where we pay the police to do the work they get to do.
Mm-hmm. I would also say too that when those police review boards are part of a consent decree, then those organizations, that community assembled and federally monitored organization, has much more authority to insist upon the implementation of a program of action that has already been determined. And such reforms like this, such accountability, is the kind of thing that is part and parcel of many of the consent decrees that followed the Ferguson, except, however, because it's a federal thing, the current administration or the past administration put no teeth behind it and just let it die. But those kind of reforms are still necessary and can be revived again. We know exactly what to ask for, and we just need to ask for it again and see if the current administration has more of an appetite for such thing, and I believe that they might.
Dr. Ahmed, I see a question in the chat directed to you. How do we build a mother's love kinship into our criminal justice policies? And what can we do practically to achieve that noble goal on the local, state, and federal levels? That's quite a question.
Yes, that's quite a question. That would be probably a whole nother conference just focused on that one particular question. So I'm going to ask my colleagues to also please jump in and help me sort of flesh out this question, which I think is really important. I would first start with just the basics, that each individual has to engage others using those principles. So we're thinking about when we're even applying justice, or we have to make a decision, are we making the decision that's the most just, or are we aligning our decision with our sort of preference? So for example, are we looking at preserving our job status, or how we're viewed in our community? And we're not necessarily focusing on what's right or what's correct, but we're using that as a sort of measure for justice. In terms of the mothering aspect of it, just think about how a mother, typically will engage with her child. There's an overwhelming sense of love and sacrifice for the children, and it's almost nothing that a mother would not do for a child. Also, when we think of our relatives are so important to us, our blood relatives. So how do we look at each other as blood relatives? How do we engage each other as in the same way that we would care and love our own immediate family members. That's a place to start, but it definitely has to start from how women, the sort of the model of how mothers mother their children. And we all have different ways, sometimes culturally, how mothering takes place. We have the warm but strict mothers, and so sometimes that's necessary. And sometimes we're, very loving and forgiving towards our children. That's another aspect of mothering as well. But I'm gonna pass it over to some of my colleagues here on the panel to help me with that question.
Well, I mean, I think we're kind of sensing some of that shift right now in our public policy, right? Some of the funding for the kinds of projects that we're talking about, a new way of looking at criminal justice, is coming from the old punitive approach. So like here in St. Louis, we have what we call the old workhouse. It's the old city jail. It's pretty much, it's an old city jail, right? 150 years old place that's been really in disrepair, that they've been incarcerating people in, and we've been struggling to get it closed. So the closest we've come is to move some of the funding from places like that to things like cure violence, right? So when we start looking at, we talk about bail reform. Can we go to a system of looking at people, as human beings on your own volition, like Balantas I was saying, you are released on your own volition as a citizen, as a human being, not because of the kind of purse that you or someone behind you has. So I think those attributes of care, of nurturing, using those to guide policy rather than heavy-handed punitive behaviors is a kind of shift in that direction.
I saw earlier in the chat that there was a gentleman or someone who was who had a penchant for a passion for working to relieve people, keep prisoners from isolation. I think that's an interesting step. When people go to prison, they are out of sight, out of mind. Nobody is paying attention. They are captive, and they are at the mercy of whoever is administering that prison's facility. I imagine all manner of things goes on in the prison, and if we think we have police brutality here in the society in general, can you just imagine what kind of brutality they suffer while incarcerated? And then to go to Attorney Balanta's point, there was a time when the prison system was supposed to be rehabilitating our prisoners. And I think Saf has mentioned this too, when in his talk, and it is turned into pure punishment. There is no real rehabilitative effort made with prisoners at all, and they are simply doing time. And then to speak to the point that Attorney Rahman had earlier in terms of the adaptability of human nature, once a person goes into that environment, what is it that we're creating? They're going to adapt to survive in whatever conditions that they're facing. And so someone who's relatively innocent, made a mistake, petty crime, finds himself or herself in that environment, now they have to adapt to survive. And after the time they spend in that environment, we expect them to come out and to fit perfectly back into society, when in fact, that was probably the initial problem from the beginning, that they didn't have a way to fit in before they committed the crime in the first place. So we have that circular system is just chewing up human lives. And I commend the person who has an interest to pay attention to that. I think we all need to pay a little more attention to those institutions.
Yes, and can I jump in and make a comment as well, just to follow up? Thank you. So I'm also in teacher education, and one of my favorite authors is a man by the name of Parker Palmer. And he talks about, when I teach, I project the condition of my soul onto the students. And so when we're in these helping service types of positions, we really have to look at the kind of soul that the individual is bringing to the position. And so there really needs to be more effort with assessing the inner work that a person is engaged in. And that's part of the struggle that we're having with policing, is because there are good police folks, I mean, police individuals, men and women, who are doing a great job. They're protecting us. But we have these individuals who morally, they're very challenged in terms of their condition, how they relate to others, and that inhumanity, that occurs in how they engage with the citizens. So I think that before anyone gets hired in any type of position, particularly where it's a helping position where you're engaging with others, that there needs to be more effort on assessing the type of individual who's coming into the position, and also working ongoing with individuals who are in the prison system, so that the prison guards don't become hardened because of all that they see. And then that hardened view now translates into more hardened types of behaviors towards each other. So it's not as practical, and it sounds a bit ambiguous, but it's actually so critical, because when you're dealing with other human beings, your condition of your soul, your heart, and how you your views on justice will really impact how you treat others. So I would say really being very selective in who we hire, that they should always be involved in some sort of training and assessment, that there's mental health support for individuals who are in high level stress jobs. Those are ways that we can start to think about, having a kinder, more just way of looking at working with professionals.
The issue of justice, the definition and understanding of justice is always complicated, but we can make it simple. We're a country that prides ourselves in having rights, and we want to make sure nobody is trampling or denying us our rights. And that is legitimate. However, that is a very precarious place to be, because justice is more about the rights of others than about our rights. And if we never reach the place where we have the idea of kindness and kinship, where we are willing to delay our rights and focus more on protecting the rights of others, then we probably will never achieve absolute justice. So when we look at being just, look to be just first, to protect the rights of others. And I can tell from your presence here today, I believe that is all of your orientation, or you probably wouldn't be here. I think our time has just about expired. I want to thank you for your presence and your participation. We hope you have found this session to be informative and useful. Please contact us using, I think we have a slide that we can put up as a way to contact us. And we would love to hear from you. So God bless you, and work for justice with kindness and kinship. Peace be unto you.
Thank you.